Hello, and welcome to our online audio lecture for History 212. This is a continuation of the lecture that was started in Wednesday's class. And as you remember, the topic of our lecture was Vietnam, what was once America's longest war until recently when replaced by U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. So, as we were talking about in class on Wednesday, Vietnam and the American war in Vietnam is a result of the U.S. Um, commitment to containing communism. Vietnam doesn't really make a lot of sense unless we place it within the specific confines of the Cold War. So, we talked about a few of these principles on Wednesday. Vietnam was located in southeastern Asia. It had been, as was the other parts of the region, including Laos and Cambodia, a part of the French Empire. And it had been a part of the French Empire almost 100 years. So during the Second World War, the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia, and many of the U.S. military operatives in Vietnam worked secretly for the U.S. against the Japanese. After the war, the Vietnamese people believed that they were going to be free and independent, and they celebrated and waved American flags. And then the French came back to reclaim their empire, and they were engaged in a war, as we discussed in class, from around 1947 to 1954. And when the French decided to withdraw from the region, the U.S. believed very much in the domino theory, right? And the idea that any country that shared a border with the Soviet or communist country would fall to communism. And then that seemingly happened, right? China borders the Soviet Union, China became communist. China borders Korea, it became communist. Whoops, right here. So there certainly was an argument to be made. The eastern part of Europe had fallen to communism, and they also bordered the Soviet Union. So all of those factors helped to create a situation where the U.S. believed that it needed to contain communism in Vietnam. So why does the U.S. fight a war in Vietnam? It is because of communism and our decision, beginning with the Truman Doctrine, to contain it anywhere that it would pop up around the world. Um, the Vietnam War has a number of dubious distinctions in U.S. history, and one is that it was the longest, and that is up until Afghanistan, and most unpopular war of modern history. The slide I have says 58,000 deaths. That could be more like 67,000 deaths. As I was talking about in class, the average age of the soldier drafted was 19 compared to 24 during the Second World War. There are a number of men who come back wounded, which becomes a national problem in the 1980s. And the war was very expensive, as all wars are. When the French decided to withdraw their forces from Vietnam in 54, we see nationalist forces leading the direction in what will be South Vietnam. As we discussed in class, in 1954, there was a peace agreement throughout Vietnam, and a temporary partition was selected at the 17th parallel, and it split the country basically in two, following a similar pattern that had happened in Korea, the partitioning of Germany after the Second World War. This seemingly was a trend. Um, so the North was communist, the South was a democratic um, capitalist country. The North, right here, is led by Ho Chi Minh, who was one of the operatives who worked for the U.S., with the U.S., during the Second World War. So according to these peace accords, as we discussed on Wednesday, um, there was to be a national election in 1956, 2 years later, to reunify the country. And if the people wanted communism, so be it. And if the people voted to have a democratic capitalist society, they were going to adhere to that. The U.S. did not want these um, elections to take place and very much worked to undermine them. The U.S. helps to basically install a puppet regime in South Vietnam, which was led by this guy, Diem, who became known because of how much the people loathed him. He was the opposite of what people wanted in terms of their leader. And the people went to very great lengths to demonstrate this. Of course, he was pro US and he was the American choice for the job. Um, as I said before, the domino theory, this is the idea that if South Vietnam was to fall, other countries around Southeast Asia would also collapse to communism, and then you have a global communist movement. South Vietnam under the leadership of Diem. Diem claimed that his newly created government was under attack from communists in the north. In late 57, Diem began to counterattack with the help of the CIA. At the same time, he's passing a number of repressive acts that made it very much legal for the government to lock up and imprison anyone suspected of communism without any formal charges. Not a popular move among the people. Opposition to Diem was fairly vast and coming from a wide variety of the population. Buddhist monks, nuns, student protests, business people, the intellectuals, peasants. Again, a lot of different types of Vietnamese were not pleased with his leadership, did not want him as leader, wanted him to step down, and also accused him of very much creating a hostile environment. Um, the communists supported the creation of a broad-based united front to help mobilize Southerners in opposition to the government in South Vietnam. This was known as the National Liberation Front, or the NLF. And this is a group that formed in the South in opposition to Diem, and they wanted a national, unified Vietnam, and they wanted him to go. In a series of papers inside the U.S., Washington insiders denounced the NLF. They claim it's a puppet regime of Hanoi. They call it the Viet Cong, which was an incredibly derogatory term. The NLF, on the other hand, continued to argue throughout the entire scope of the war that it was autonomous, that it was independent of the communist movement, that it was advocating for a national Vietnam, a unified Vietnam. So, as I said on Wednesday, when we think about Vietnam, we think about how two wars, two very different wars, were being fought simultaneously. On the US side, this is a war about communism, which makes the objectives a bit more complex, um, far less tangible than, say, a war of independence, which is what the NLF was fighting for. They had just gotten off a war with the French. Before that, the Japanese. These people hadn't really gone 30 years without nonstop fighting. Um, so they were prepared to continue to do it in a way that strained the U.S. in all of its resources. So we'll come back to that in just a minute. All right. December 1961, the White Papers, and 61 President Kennedy sent a team to Vietnam to report on the condition. These reports became known as the White Papers. And the reports say we needed to increase our military presence, we needed to provide more money, we need to bring in quote unquote advisors to help to stabilize the region. Kennedy weighs his options and decides to sort of take a middle of the road approach. He's also getting advice that says something else. He's getting advice that says this is a war of independence. We should not get involved. We should let these people fight a civil war and attempt to stay out of it. So he tried to take a middle of the road approach. They implement what was known as the Strategic Hamlet Program. And this was a way to sort of go through the rural countryside and um, interact with communities who they believed to be on their side. The National Liberation Front, on the other hand, was very successful, and um, it was bringing the South Vietnamese government to its knees. As I talked about on class, there were Buddhists who were self-immolating, which means they burned themselves on fire in protest. And they knew that these pictures would make headlines, and they did it in many ways for that reason. Um, in 1963, there's an actual military coup against Diem, where he and his brother are shot and later killed. In an interesting twist of fate, 3 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated and shot and killed. The succeeding president, Lyndon Johnson, is going to escalate U.S. involvement, and this is when we get an official expansion or move for war. In 1964, a U.S. naval ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, outside of North Vietnam, puts out a distress signal saying that it had been attacked by North Vietnamese forces. And after that, the U.S. is going to officially go to war through what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. What's most significant about this is that the Congress very much gave Lyndon Johnson a blank check to wage war from the Oval Office as he saw fit, and no other president had ever wielded so much power to do so. The first real campaign of U.S. involvement was Operation Rolling Thunder, and this was the heavy bombing campaign. The idea was certainly to use the U.S. military technology to decimate the North Vietnamese, and the suspicion was it wouldn't take very long. The U.S. forms this massive bombing campaign, and more bombs are dropped on North Vietnam than were dropped in the entirety of the Second World War, certainly excluding nuclear bombs, conventional bombs. And this damage you can still see today from satellites. So this was Operation Rolling Thunder. And this was supported by the use of napalm and phosphorus bombs, chemical warfare, basically, that was illegal and was used nonetheless and was captured within these photos that became sort of the horrific scenes of what was happening in Vietnam. Here you see more children who had lost their limbs to deadly chemical agents. This was known as dioxin, and again, you can see the chromosomal damage that was done to these children, and this could have also been, right, the result of these chemicals being dropped on young girls who then had babies, and certainly women who are pregnant. This is also the first war that we see the extensive use of helicopters, which very much becomes the primary mechanism of engagement, of sort of dropping men in and out of the jungle throughout the war. How did the North Vietnamese fight back against the U.S.? Well, they're using guerrilla tactics. They had built a series of tunnels throughout the ground, basically that had been there since the Second World War, that they used to channel supplies back and forth. So they were prepared to be at war, to stay at war. They distributed to the sort of welfare of other peasants in the South Vietnam. They had cheap weapons. They had things that were very portable. Again, they were prepared for a variety of ways to have sustained war. Um, I mentioned the tunnels. Here's an example of that. The Vietnamese built these large tunnel complexes. Um, and again, these tunnel lines went in and out all throughout the countries, including parts of Cambodia and Laos. Um, by 65, 66, the U.S. Began a more aggressive campaign within peasants, within villages in rural Vietnam, and they called this search and destroy. Um, and they're basically going around burning homes, torturing men, women, and children to try to get information. Um, the U.S. is confounded that Operation Rolling Thunder wasn't a success. The war in Vietnam was also having an impact on people at home in very specific ways. One of those ways, of course, was the draft. So prior to 1966, if you were drafted, oh, right, no, beginning in 1966, they're going to implement the draft. So in 1966, if you were drafted, you could get out of the draft by being in college, by being married, without having children, and this is going to change. Um, as American men begin to lose their lives, we start to see a larger peace movement, an anti-war movement happening on college campuses, and that makes sense because those kids were getting drafted. Um, Anti-war protests, as I said before, is popping up all over campuses, all over the country. The 1968 Democratic Convention was one of the most famous incidents of the anti-war movement. Hundreds of thousands of people came to Chicago to protest, and leaders of the anti-war movement and the Black Panther Party are arrested in Chicago and brought to trial. In 1968, the year 1968 is a pivotal year in U.S. history for a number of reasons, but in terms of Vietnam, it signaled to the public that the U.S. wasn't winning this war. So in January 1968, the Vietnamese staged what was known as the Tet Offensive, and Tet is the name of a Vietnamese holiday. And up until that point, the majority of the war had been fought in northern Vietnam. So, what the Tet Offensive effectively did was to bring the fighting down. So, the North Vietnamese forces attacked about 33 different military installations around South Vietnam, all at the same time. And the U.S. wasn't expecting it, didn't anticipate it. And this demonstrated a number of things. One, it demonstrated that the war was being brought to where the U.S. was located rather than just being waged up north. Two, it demonstrated that there was a lot of support for the North within the population of the South. And three, it demonstrated that there was no end in sight for U.S. involvement of this war. In 1968, in March, news breaks of what will be known as the My Lai Massacre, in which accounts of U.S. military involvement in essentially war crimes breaks out. Members of a platoon were engaged in acts that killed up to 400 men, women, and children, and including certainly rape. So by 1968, March of 1968, President Johnson, who believed very much he could support this war and end poverty in America, realizes that he doesn't know his way out. He does decide that he isn't going to run for president in 1968. So we are going to see Richard Nixon, who runs for president in 1968 as a Republican, Johnson, of course, was a Democrat, Nixon is a Republican, is going to run in 68 on the platform of law and order. Um, but, sorry, just like Trump. But he also is running, he runs on the ticket of law and order, but he also says that he has a secret plan to end the war. And when he gets elected in 68, he implements said secret plan to end the war. And this was known as Vietnamization. So the term Vietnamization means that U.S. troops would train South Vietnamese troops to take over the bulk of the war, of the actual fighting of the war, and then that would allow the U.S. to slowly withdraw from the area, bringing troops home, which would ease the minds of American parents and, casually withdraw. So that was the idea. Vietnamization wasn't really working. We will continue to employ this method. We're employing this right now in Iraq and continuously finding problems with it. So by 68, 69, the war is still going on. Vietnamization is really not turning out. And the U.S. is escalating its involvement, not retreating. And the U.S. does this by bombing Laos and Cambodia. It steps up a air campaign again. And this time, not only is it hitting North Vietnam, but also Laos and Cambodia, two separate sovereign countries of which we are not at war. This was also kept public from the people. By 1970, this has become public knowledge, and the idea that the U.S. was bombing two other sovereign nations that we're not at war with and expanding the war, as the president was talking about getting out of the war, only increases protests against the war. It's still, however, supported by the majority of the people. This is going to change when 4 college students are killed on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio during an anti-war rally in 1970. This picture that you see right here becomes the iconic image of what many saw was the result of America's longest war. The idea is when you fight a war, the people suffer. And here students were demonstrating, and the National Guard were called out to preserve order on the campus and shot into the crowd, killing 4 students. Of course, the average age of the National Guardsmen was fairly young, as was these students. But many people saw this as a turning point where they wanted an end. They wanted an end to the war. And it's only after Kent State, when the war unofficially begins in 56, officially begins in 64, it's only after 1970 that we really start to see in the polls that Americans no longer support the war. It takes a while before the population gets there. Shock waves across the nation, certainly, as people are shocked at what happened at Jackson State in Mississippi. People are also shot and killed, prompting one mother to famously cry, "They are killing our babies in Vietnam and in our backyard." What was known as the Christmas bombings, this happened in December 1972. The Nixon administration unleashed a series of deadly bombing raids against targets in North Vietnam's largest cities of Hanoi and Hang Thang. These attacks, now known as the Christmas bombings, brought immediate condemnation from the international community and forced the Nixon administration to reconsider its tactics. By 73, we see a movement within the Nixon White House to bring about some sort of peace accord. And that begins the Paris Peace Agreement, in which which we will end the conflict. Um, by 1975, the country has, South Vietnam has collapsed to communist forces. We see pictures like this of many of the ways in which the North Vietnamese will treat many South Vietnamese who were loyal to the U.S. We find that the drop, that another implication of U.S. involvement for this long was the environmental destruction of the entire country. More tonnage of high explosives were dropped on Vietnam than the whole scope of World War II. And yet, that still didn't stop the trail of goods that Vietnamese were traipsing up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, these secret tunnels that I spoke of earlier. Why did the U.S. lose the war in Vietnam? Another answer to this is the North Vietnamese people conducted a people's war in which everyone played a part. Ho Chi Minh is noted of calling his people ants, of saying this is a war that'll be fought by every child, every mother, every grandmother. That wasn't the war that the U.S. was fighting. Another idea as to why the U.S. does not win this war was because of how unpopular it was. By 1970, there was a full-on peace movement that was really not only anti-war, but bringing anti-nuclear, environmentalist messages into all of this, really people protesting for a much peaceful society. So in some ways, that explains it. There is an idea in government known as the Vietnam Syndrome, which is you don't get into a war unless you have public support. Another explanation as to why the U.S. lost the war in Vietnam after 1969, there were deep questions about the efficiency of U.S. troops. As I spoke about on Wednesday, there was a serious drug problem. Vietnam was known for its availability of opium. That part of Southeast Asia, opium is very much in abundance. So many of the soldiers, again, average age 19, are getting access to drugs. Drugs are very cheap. And many of them returned home with a substantial heroin or opium problem. Another reason that the U.S. may have lost this war is that the U.S. never really understood anything about Vietnamese people. They never took the time to learn about their history, their culture, and we had a certain amount of cultural arrogance about ourselves and them. Another explanation, America was not prepared to keep losing high numbers of casualties. Again, we were not prepared for jungle warfare, which is what we were fighting. Of course, the strength of the tunnel system, these massive casualties. So that's it. Let me know if you have any questions, issues, or concerns.